The Cuban Revolution ended in July of 1959 when Fidel Castro took over Cuba and overthrew former leader Batista. After Castro became the Prime Minister of Cuba, it became a communist country. The Eisenhower administration was not delighted by this change because Castro's takeover lost the United States their playground, also known as Havana, Cuba. Since the 1920s, Havana had become a playground for American celebrities as well as gangsters and their crimes. After Castro took over Cuba, he no longer allowed that to happen. The United States President at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a war hero, had a lingering problem with Cuba becoming a communist country, and so he felt that he had no choice but to do something about it. During President Eisenhower's administration, in March of 1960, the CIA set up training in Guatemala. The purpose of this was to train a small army of Cuban exiles to use against Cuba. This plan was not kept a secret as it got into the public very quickly. When John F. Kennedy became President of the United States, he authorized Eisenhower's plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro and his revolution. The only thing he wanted to change was to disguise the United States' involvement. The invasion site was a remote, swampy area on the southern coast of Cuba where a night landing might bring a force ashore against little resistance and help to hide any U.S. involvement. Unfortunately, the landing site also left the invading force more than 80 miles from refuge in Cuba's Escambray Mountains if anything went wrong. The original invasion plan called for 2 airstrikes against Cuban air bases. A 1,400-man invasion force would disembark under the cover of darkness and launch a surprise attack. Paratroopers dropped in advance of the invasion would disrupt transportation and repel Cuban forces. Simultaneously, a smaller force would land on the east coast of Cuba to create confusion. The main force would advance across the island to Matanzas and set up a defensive position. The United Revolutionary Front would then send leaders from South Florida and establish a temporary government. Even if this plan did work, the real success of the plan depended on the Cuban population joining the invaders. The first mishap occurred on April 15, 1961, when 8 bombers left Nicaragua to bomb Cuban airfields. The CIA had used outdated World War II B-26 bombers and painted them to look like Cuban Air Force planes. The bombers missed many of their targets and left most of Castro's air force intact. As news broke of the attack, photos of the repainted U.S. planes became public and revealed American support for the invasion. Because of this, President Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. On April 17th, the Cuban Exile Invasion Force, also known as Brigade 2506, landed at beaches along the Bay of Pigs and immediately came under heavy fire. Cuban planes bombed the invaders, sank 2 escort ships, and destroyed half of the exiles' air support. Bad weather hampered the ground force, which had to work with soggy equipment and insufficient ammunition. Knowing what was coming, over the next 24 hours, Castro ordered roughly 20,000 troops to advance towards the beach, and the Cuban Air Force continued to control the skies. As the situation grew increasingly grim, President Kennedy authorized an air umbrella at dawn on April 19th. 6 unmarked American fighter planes took off to help defend the brigade's B-26 aircraft that was flying alone. But the planes arrived an hour late, most likely confused by the change in time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba. All of these planes were shot down by the Cubans, and the invasion was put to an end later that day. Some Cuban exiles escaped to the sea while the rest were killed or rounded up and imprisoned by Castro's forces. Almost 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 surrendered, and more than 100 were killed. This failure greatly impacted the United States. The Bay of Pigs invasion did not produce a quality reputation for President Kennedy and the United States as a whole. This invasion was not well planned or executed, and because of this, it negatively impacted the United States. The Ghost of the Bay of Pigs invasion directly influenced how the Cuban Missile Crisis was handled. President Kennedy was looking to re-establish his reputation after the Bay of Pigs invasion. He felt embarrassed and humiliated after the invasion failed. Not even 2 years after the invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, also under Kennedy's administration and having to deal with Castro. The United States' obsession of control over Cuba created the problem that ultimately caused the Bay of Pigs invasion. Shown by Kennedy's poor decisions in planning, humiliation, and more conflict is the result of the Bay of Pigs invasion. This failed invasion led to all of the diplomatic decisions regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis did resemble some of the results and occurrences in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuba and the United States were both heavily involved in the events. There were also problems of communism from the Cold War in both the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was also a key difference between these two circumstances. The Bay of Pigs invasion was not well planned because it was taken from the previous administration. It was not researched and it was not well executed. Because of this poor planning, it might have caused more trouble in the long run. The Cuban Missile Crisis was more planned out and better strategized. Although it was a quicker response, there were many more ideas, perspectives, and meetings to form a more perfect plan. This unsuccessful invasion of Cuba was a poorly researched, poorly planned, and poorly executed invasion. Its failure brought great humiliation to the United States and its newly elected president.